Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining me today in this experimental podcast, or not podcast, webcast. Lots of casts going on. I can't hear any of you, so hopefully you guys can actually hear me. And we're going to talk about Angular 2 and ASP.NET Core 1.0. As many of you know, I'm the author of a Pluralsight course on ASP.NET 5, which is now called ASP.NET Core 1.0. And we'll be updating that soon for the upcoming RC2 and the RTM. And I've been playing with Angular 2 and rewriting my blog using all these technologies and wanted to kind of share that with a bunch of people. Uh, I may do a course in Angular 2 at some point in the future, but it's not really on the table right now. I think John Papa's working on a great course that everyone should go watch. Of Angular 2 and ASP.NET Core because there are caveats in using it together. Most of the examples I see out there are with a plain HTML file or with a Node project where you don't have some of the complexities that you're going to run into with ASP.NET Core. So I'm going to take a risk here, and we're just going to write a bunch of code. You know, that's the style that I prefer. And so let's see how much trouble we can get in. I've got a ASP.NET Core project here. This is one that's, maybe 10% into the process. This is actually my blog. Go ahead and run it. You can just kind of see it. We're not going to focus on writing the ASP.NET Core project. If you want to see that, of course, I show that on my course. I also have a webcast through Pluralsight that kind of walks through some of the starts. But this is just a plain ASP.NET project using some Bootstrap stuff. And I want to implement this contact page that I've sort of stubbed out here using Angular 2 and kind of see what that experience is like. So if we come back here and let's get rid of that build screen. And I'm just going to show you where we are. We're in a controller called root. And in this root controller, I've implemented an action for showing the contact page, and I actually have an action that I already built up for actually doing the sending of the message to me. I'm not going to go through the specifics of this, but this project is actually a public GitHub repo, so you can see kind of how I'm building the my new blog as I continue to build it. It's in a pretty early state right now, so don't be too mean about the state of the code. You'll see some things like just commented out lines of code and such, but should be a good starting point for actually adding Angular to it. So let's go ahead and look at the view, because that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time. And let's see if we can get Visual Studio to actually open a file. Woohoo! So here I have that simple view of my form, and I'm going to actually comment out the form for a minute. We're going to reuse this code in a moment inside our Angular 2 project. But what I want to start out with before we even bring Angular in is the idea of sort of a placeholder. The idea around Angular 2 is this idea of creating components, and the components are, simply named elements on a page that then have some code and templates and things in them. So I'm going to create a new element, and I'm just going to call it my contact page. And this will just be a div as far as the individual browsers see it. And because Angular might need to load up, or there might be a point at which there is a delay because of a hiccup to the internet or whatever, I'm going to also put something in here that will be sort of the placeholder that will be replaced with our component. So I'm just going to kind of do something nice with font awesome, spinning, let's say a circle. Not. So we have a little spinning icon, and I'll just say loading. So before we've done any of this, let's just go ahead and look and see what this looks like in the browser. We can see we just have this section of our page that just shows loading. This is the part of the page we want to inject the Angular2 project into. Let me check the chat window to make sure there's no big questions going on. Nope. Okay, good. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So we've got this just placeholder for Angular. And so how do we get Angular? My first instinct when doing this was, well, we'll go into Bower. We'll have Bower add the Angular2 project. But Angular2 in its current form, which I believe is beta 2, still isn't being delivered by Bower. And so they're really relying on NPM for package management. And this may be where the future of web development is going. Bower might be going away. A lot of people have been talking about different sort of package managing out there, JavaScript package manager, using NPM, using Bower, and a lot of competing ones. So the Angular team has chosen NPM as sort of the solution there. And I'm already using NPM here. Here's my package JSON to loading Gulp for my developer dependencies. So I don't have to bring in package management and all of that. It's already built into the project, but I want to bring Angular. So I'll go to NPM and I'm just going to add Angular2 as the name of the project. And we'll see, ooh, we're in beta 3 now. I'm going to go ahead and pull in the beta 3 version. And I also know I need another project, which is System.js. This is the wrapper around different ways of loading in and doing dependency injection inside of Angular2. So they're both going to be required for what we want to do here. And when I load those, when I save those in ASP.NET, in Visual Studio, more importantly, those are going to be pulled in and resolved for me. By the way, if you ever have a chance to do a live webcast, you probably don't want to use a bunch of unreleased software. So we're using ASP.NET Core 1.0, which hasn't even been renamed yet in the project as that, but that's where we're going. And that's in an RC1 state. Angular 2 is in a beta state. And so, this might really go and blow up in my face. But luckily, it'll be preserved as a YouTube video forever if it does go badly. So the dependencies have been resolved, and they've been resolved into this folder, which many of you might be familiar with, called Node Modules. This is where all the different of Angular and its dependencies have been put. You'll see Gulp that I had from earlier, but I also have now Angular2, which is the Angular2 project, System.js, which I required, but also some other projects that they depend on, like RxJS, which is the Rx library for JavaScript that it's using, ES-Shim and ES6 Shim and ES6 Promise. They're both being used to sort of do the ECMAScript 6 magic for ECMAScript 5 compatible browsers. We'll eventually get to the right place. And so we can see that this is where all of our code is. And the code in here is, if we look at Angular 2 bundles, for example, this is actually the Angular 2 JavaScript that we're going to use to run our project. But if you've worked with ASP.NET 5 or ASP.NET Core before, you know that we actually can't get at these, right? This www root folder is sort of magical and special in that it is where the public delivered files are. If we look at this, we'll see this is where I have CSS and images, JavaScript, third-party libraries like Bootstrap and jQuery. Those are all surfaced there because we're going to be exposing them through the web server. So none of our actual code can be delivered because it's not in the www root. Our Bower packages magically get there because of a configuration that Bower has that says, hey, when you pull in a Bower package, I'm going to put it in that www root folder for you. Good sirens. Hope everyone can hear that. We could do that with this Node modules as well, but the Node stuff, some of it is developer, some of it is, some of it is for development, and you're just getting a lot of code here. Same sort of happens with Bower, but Bower's client side only. So what we want to do is figure out how to get these files into www root. This is where one of the little bit of complexity comes into using Angular 2 today with ASP.NET Core. So the way I'm going to do it, you can do it any way you want, but I'm going to use Gulp. So I'm using Gulp on the project to animate, not to animate, but to automate some things. So I'm just going to use Gulp and create a new task that I'll call NG2 for lack of a better name. If you haven't used Gulp before, I'm not going to go a lot into it, but basically you're going to write JavaScript to do things at build time or after build time or pre-build time to automate functions. And in this case, what I want to automate is executing the copy of all of those libraries into www-root for us. So in Gulp, I can say source, and I'm going to give it an array of sources to copy, and then I'm going to say pipe. So I'm going to take these sources, and I'm going to pipe them someplace. And where I'm going to pipe them is gulp.destination, and I'm going to give it a directory to put it in. In this case, that will be www-root lib, and I'll just call it ng2. So we're going to put all the libraries we're going to require into this ng2 directory. And this will be the source of the files. Now we could get very specific, and when I probably deploy this, I'll be very specific about exactly what JavaScripts I need. But to just get us going, I'm going to do node components, get rid of that leading, Angular2, bundles, and I'm just going to grab all the files from bundles. And I'll do the same for system.js dist. Now, I'm sorry, it's dist. So I know this just because I've looked at the documentation. I know that bundles is the result of what the Angular2 compilation is, and so this is where the sort of final things are. And the same for system.js. They keep them in a folder called dist. There's no real magic to knowing that. What you might be wondering if you haven't used npm a lot is why is there all these other files in here? These other files are actually part of their build. So this is actually the entire thing that is required to build Angular 2 is what's being pulled down, not just the resulting couple of files. Once we have the gulp process, let's go ahead and look at our project.json. That is the ASP.NET Core project. And we'll see that I'm running in a pre-build process any npm tasks that we need. Gulp actually doesn't have these right now, so I'm just going to go back to my Gulp file and in Visual Studio, go to Task Runner Explorer. This is going to show us the Gulp file and its tasks. And one of the things I can do here is I could run it, but I could also bind it to, let's say, after build. And what this does is it makes sure that every time I build this project, the last step it does is actually run this gulp piece here. How do we know it's being done? Let's go up to www-root. And it failed. Okay, let's see what I did wrong. Let's run this and see if we get any errors. Let's clear this. So that should have copied it. Let's see if I actually did need the starting slash. Let's try it one more time. This is what happens when you do this in front of an audience. Let me open this up in File Explorer and see if it actually copied it. No, it's not copying it. What did I do wrong? This is not when you want it to actually go badly. Okay, bundles, dist, source. That all looked good. Why is suddenly it failing on us? Running gulp. Says it's finished. Just get the name wrong. www.root lib ng2. Wow. That is embarrassing to watch this not work well. Doo-doo-doo. While you guys watch me get nervous after Gulp file. Yeah, that should all just magically happen. Let's try one more thing, which is restarting Visual Studio. Did I mention never do this live on the air? How are we doing on time? Oh, we got plenty of time. Let's go clockwise to speed it up. My favorite joke. I'm hoping all of you are out there laughing. Let me check and make sure there aren't any questions. No, it looks like we're good. We are live. Okay, good. And let's run it one more time. Let's see what happens. If not, I'm going to manually copy it from a project I already have. And we'll find out why this isn't working later. So let's go to File Explorer real quick. And I'm just going to... I have a test one that has the files I need. And we'll just go... and we'll figure it out why this worked yesterday and isn't working today. Sorry, guys. After... So, don't know why the Gulp is failing on me. Doesn't really like me in the moment, but we've got our ng2 folder that now has a bunch of the files we actually need. So what do we do? Let's go to our view here and let's actually bring the scripts in. So I'm going to need Angular2, and I'm going to actually grab Angular2 dev, which is the one with all the sort of debugging and rich messages in. And before Angular2, I also need system.js. And here I'm going to grab the system source.js, which again is sort of the developer version of that. So we've got those brought in, and system.js uses a methodology about loading in sort of the root module for the project. And so let's sort of start there. We're going to start with a script here. This uses system.js. To import a project we're just going to call app main. And I'll show you where that is in just a minute. For app main, we're just going to also pipe any errors into console.error find console. All this little magic line does is that if any errors happen while the system import is happening, go ahead and show them in the console of the browser. And that'll just help us in some debugging. So what is this app main really about? I'm going to create a new folder in my www root called app. And then I'm going to create a new file called main.js. This is going to be the starting point for our Angular2 component that's going to run this particular contact page. Now, we didn't have to call it main. We could have called it contact-page if you have a bunch of these or whatever you want, but I'm just going to call it main just to sort of simplify. And Angular2 is taking an approach that you want to, it wants to live in the future. Now, maybe some of you that are waiting for it to be released for a long time thought that the future would have come by time they released, which may actually happen. But their idea was that there's all this great stuff coming in the next version of JavaScript and even the version of JavaScript after that. And it's relying on a lot of these pieces, classes, annotations and attributes and things like that, that it wants to use in the new world of JavaScript. It really wants to live in that space. But the browsers haven't caught up yet. The ECMAScript guys aren't ready for ECMAScript 6 to be sort of blessed quite yet, though it's getting really close. And the browser manufacturers, depending on which one you're using, or developers, aren't really ready for it either. So what Angular envisions is that we're going to live in a world that looks a lot like this. And so we have a JavaScript where we're going to say, let's import a package, and I'm going to bring something called Bootstrap, which isn't the Bootstrap CSS and site framework that we're also using. It's actually a component from Angular2 that says, I know how to start up a page or an app, if you want to think about it in that way. And this import syntax is something that's coming in the newer versions of JavaScript that says, go get this as a component and bring it in as this object that I can now use. And we're going to bring in another one that we're just going to call component. Component is a section of a page or control, whatever you want to call it. And this is from Angular 2 core. Now the editor here isn't giving us a lot of complaint because ES6 or ECMAScript 6 is something that it might actually know about, and we could use some tricks there to fool it. But let's export a class contact page. Now, class is something you're probably more familiar with in C# or those sorts of projects, but this is also coming in the next version of JavaScript, and we're going to use that Bootstrap component here to bootstrap it with contact form, and then I'm going to give it an empty array. This actually isn't required quite yet, but this is going to be a list of other components that we may need in our project. And so this is the way that sort of bringing in other modules that are required. We're not quite where we want to be because Angular depends on these, what I like to call attributes, though they call it something different, but it's a way to add metadata to different objects. And they start with an at and then the name, and the name we're going to use is component. And component's going to allow us to put some data about this contact page. And one of them is the selector. And the selector is contact page. Now, this may look familiar because back on our view, we have contact page as an element. So this selector is saying, go find the thing called contact page, and this is where the class itself is going to inject some code into it. This is the part of the page that this component is responsible for. And I'll go ahead and put a template, which is what are we going to use as the starting HTML. So I'm going to start with something really simple, like just contact Sean as a header. This all looks good, but probably unfamiliar if you've done a lot of JavaScript. And in fact, over here, it says we have an invalid character because even our editor doesn't know what to do with this. And in fact, when we look at in the browser, it's not going to be able to make sense of a lot of these different pieces because the browsers haven't really caught up to where we're going with this. So the trick here is actually, instead of using JavaScript, which we could use, and we could use some ES6 tools to compile it into an ES5 compatible or a ECMAScript 5 compatible version, I'm going to use TypeScript. And this is actually what the team itself uses. So TypeScript is the Microsoft extension to JavaScript that's including a lot of these pieces by default. When we change it to TypeScript, we actually start to get even more sort of problems with it. And the reason for that is we haven't configured the way that TypeScript is supposed to be compiled. This is another one of those things that's going to be important for you to sort of understand. So let's go up to our project, and I'm going to add a new file. And there's a project template inside ASP.NET called TypeScript JSON configuration file, or tsconfig.json. This is a small piece of configuration that says, when I compile TypeScript, what do I need it to do? Do I want source maps? Am I targeting ECMAScript 5, which we are in this case? And we're going to compile in our www root. So let's get rid of that as one of the directories not to look in. And we're going to need a couple additional pieces here for Angular2's sort of version of TypeScript. And first we're going to need the module type. Modules aren't built in any certain format to begin with, but we're going to use what's called the CommonJS module type. That's the one that is compatible with both System.js and Angular. And then some of the more future stuff that TypeScript supports and that Angular2 is really relying on is emit decorator metadata. So this is taking that at component and emitting it as metadata that can be read by the JavaScript libraries at runtime. And we're also going to say experimental decorators equals true. Make sure any of these are also changed. Oh, I also want to change no emit on error, because some of the things we're going to run into, we may actually get an error that isn't really an error, but more of a warning. We want to emit the file in either case. Because we've changed these, and Visual Studio is compiling this as we make those changes, we should see that most of the errors go away, except for this, of course, contact form, because I didn't have the name. So we now actually have our component that does nothing so far, but our component that actually works. The last change we need to make before we show our first Angular, we're half an hour into the thing, and we're already we haven't even shown Angular working yet. And that's because a lot of this is sort of build up work. Once you get it sort of injected into the project, it becomes a lot easier. But let's go back to the view, because we need to tell system or configure system in a way that will load our modules. And the big one of these is that we want anything in app to download these by name, but to use .js as the extension. Because we're not delivering TypeScript to the browser, we're delivering the result of the TypeScript compilation, which is a JavaScript file. And there's a couple of pieces here. First, we're going to call config, which then takes an object that has some configuration in it. And I'm going to first do map. And map is going to allow me to say, when you see app, know that I mean it's /app. So it's the root of the website /app. Now this is the app inside of www root, but as far as the client side web code, the client side code knows it's actually at the root of our particular website. And the other thing is to specify something called package. The package is going to tell me some configuration about specific parts of our tree. We're doing this mostly so that we're not changing the default loading behavior for anything but our code. We're not going to change it for the Angular code and the System.js code and the other little pieces of code. We're just going to change it for ours. So we're saying basically inside of our little section of code, when you ask for main, I really want you to add the default extension of .js. We'll see that this works here in the import, but also when we're actually importing in our project, assuming we have enough time to get through. I've scheduled this for an hour, but I'm going to go through until we've got some meat working. It may be a little longer, maybe an hour, hour and a half. So if you have to drop off, know that this video will be available on YouTube, to either embarrass or reinforce, my ego for time immemorial. So you will be able to see this if you do have to drop off for some reason. So if all this has worked, and notice I'm not pulling the main directly, I'm letting system.js load that. Make sure this is actually loading as a file. Uh-oh, is TypeScript not? Oh, I forgot to include TypeScript. Another of the things we're going to need here, I almost forgot to show you, was in our, where'd the file go? In our package.json, we also need to include, now that we're using TypeScript, we need to use TypeScript as a development dependency. It's not actually needed when you deploy it, which is why it's in dev dependencies. Same with Gulp, but it's needed for compilation. And once it loads those, let's see if it's finished loading them yet. npm TypeScript. Then this should compile. And it's not. Wow, there's a lot of this. It's not going well. So let's restart Visual Studio one more time. It didn't help us last time, but you never know. Hope springs eternal. Talk amongst yourselves. Where is the after? There we go. So now, after we brought it back in, I'm not sure why it didn't build. You'll see that it's actually building a map file as well as a main.js file. So let's run this in the browser. And let's look at F12, see if I messed anything up. And we're getting two sorts of errors. We're getting first this tether error because I'm using Bootstrap 4. We can ignore this one. But this not finding app.main means I probably did something wrong to the configuration. Let's see how I screwed that up. Oh, it's packages. Should have noticed when it turned blue that it was wrong. Refresh. And we want it to be working, but we actually get a bunch of errors because we're missing things in RxJS. And that's because, as well as this main files, it is loading the main.js now. It's not being able to find these other parts of the system. And that's because system.Angular2 and system.js are important because those are sort of the core of it, but they rely on other libraries. Even though we didn't bring them in to our project, we're brought in as dependencies. So we go ahead and look at our ng2 again. We'll see that we have the goal. I would have had to actually bring in the ArcJS and create them in the directory manually because I copied these from the other project, which you'll see all this working in the GitHub project. I would have had to add it to the Gulp file as well, just to save us time. We have it there as the ArcJS. If we go back and refresh, we should get another set of errors, which is we need the shim when using class decorators. To reflect that, this is telling us that we need a shim to support the class decorator stuff. And luckily that is also going to be in here. So as well as these three libraries we need, right now in today's world, we need a few shims. Now these are included as well. So we're going to start with the system polyfills, which are shims to support some things that it needs cross-browser. Angular also has its own set of polyfills. And then there's a project called ES6 shim, which is some ES6 specific shims. Now the order of these is actually important in IE 10 and 11, but I don't remember what order they're in. Again, in the GitHub repository, they're in the right order. But for our use in the Firefox and Chrome, this should just work. So let's go back and see if those shims helped fix the last of it. And we now see that contact Sean gone through all this work to get at, we now have the component showing. And you can actually see here, we're getting a little call about Angular 2 is running in development mode, call enable, prod mode to enable production. Let's go ahead and do this before we implement the Angular 2 project, because we're mostly through the what is specific to ASP.NET Core about it. The last thing we can do here is use an environment section to say, I'm sorry, not environments, environment. Say in production, let's add one more piece of code here. Is Angular.enable prod mode. Was it prod mode? Yeah. So that when we actually finally send this to production, we're going to turn on the production mode of Angular as well to get that better performance and such. We're not going to get as much debugging in that, but that's on purpose. And this is one of the things I like to do in ASP.NET Core in order to make sure we're thinking about the sort of production mode of this stuff. So we've got all the pieces we need. Let's go ahead and do the more interesting piece, which is actually make some stuff work. Right? You probably are bored with all the sort of the boilerplate stuff, but I wanted you to understand how it all sort of fit together. So that's why we started here. So let's go back to our view for a minute. I'm sorry, let's go back to the main TS for a minute and let's actually do something. Let's add to our class here just a property, which I will call site owner. And I'm just going to make my, let's call Bob so you can see it actually working differently. And this is just a member of that class. By default, this is going to be a public member of that class that we can actually use up here just in using simple data binding. We're going to be able to take the property here and use it in data binding, right? So we've saved it. Let's refresh and let's see if Bob shows up. So that's, if you've done Angular 1, this should be pretty straightforward because you've always created these sort of view models and the contact page ends up being really what is that the data that's exposed to the template. But I don't really want to just encode all of my template here in line. You know, if you're sort of from the React world, this may make sense to include the template directly in the file. I hate this. I want them separated. So I'm going to change this to template URL. And I'm going to change this to some directory. And I'm just going to call it contact page.html. And I'm going to create this. This isn't required, or if you don't like this project structure, don't worry about it. Different people like to put the templates in a separate directory. Different people like to put them in the same directory. So I'm just going to go ahead and put them in the same directory. Contact page.html is a new file. So here, this is going to be the template for our contact page, right? Contact page. So this should just continue to work. Except it's looking for it in the root. So let's change this to // and I think that'll fix it. That's still looking for in the root. Do app.contact page. And now we're getting it. There's the extra quotes because I forgot to clean it up. But you'll see it's going to get and cache that template file as well without us having to worry too much about it. Let's fix the contact page, get rid of those quotes. And so we're doing some basic data binding. We've got our template, we've got our code here. Let's do something interesting, and let's add a method called I'm going to call it on header click, for lack of a better name. And you'll notice this format of class members in TypeScript is just looks a bit like just a function call without the word function, and that's really on purpose. And so if we say this dot site owner equals Sean, whenever we call this, we should be able to switch it from Bob to Sean by clicking on it. And how do we do that? We have the method that does it, the code that does it. Let's come in here and say click equals, what do I call it? On header click. So it's going to execute this when I do click, but it's by just saying click and putting the on header click, this is actually not going to do it. And we'll be able to see that because if we inspect, we'll see that this is just added this as a, you might be able to not see this depending on the resolution, but it's just adding the attribute, right? Because anything named as an attribute can be thrown on there, and Angular doesn't want to get confused with other things you're doing and run into collision. So what it's going to do instead is it's going to use parentheses around click to alert Angular2 into saying, hey, this is an event. These parentheses indicate that I'm trying to wire up an event. Let's see if that works. So by doing this, I can do that simple back and forth of knowing that because these are parentheses, that this is wiring up an event. And in fact, we can do the same thing here of saying, let's add a link around here, just an anchor tag. And I could certainly do the double brackets here and say site owner as the href. Again, not a really valid href, but a href nonetheless. And when we refresh it, we'll actually see that this is taking us to Bob, right? And when we click it, it is changing to Sean. The href is taking over, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. This works, but I find this kind of ugly using the mustache sort of style inside attributes. And so they've got another idea here, and that's where you use angle brackets to do one-way binding. So the angle bracket says, I want you to take what's in here and use it as a binding context for this href. So Bob still works, but now we're telling Angular, because of the angle brackets, that we want to bind whatever this property is to this. And this goes for really any attribute that you're going to put on here. This is on purpose, that you're cluing it to the attribute. So instead of having to have a special href, an nghref collection, it's saying, hey, we can go ahead and set any of these based on bindings because we know that brackets means to change an actual value here. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's talk about some collections. So one of the things that may have not been clear because we're in TypeScript is adding some type safety during compilation. It's not adding it at runtime, but at compilation to do some checking. So if we tried to do something like site owner equals 1, that would be perfectly valid JavaScript. But if we told site owner when we define it that this is a string, we do that with a colon and then the type before we assign it, we'll start to get TypeScript errors about it being unassignable because we've now typed it to a type. So that this has to be a Sean. And this is one of the places where TypeScript can really help you in building these large applications. Is it's this type checking at compile time is doing some of the checking so that you can find these errors earlier and earlier in the cycle. It sort of gives you the best of both worlds, not the heaviness of type safety at runtime. And again, this is opt-in as you want to. There's no necessity for using type safety everywhere. This just helps you sort of gain the benefit where it's useful and ignore and gain the benefit of the looseness of not having types where you want to. So you can do both. Because remember, TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. Everything that works in JavaScript continues to work here. So I'm going to create a new type. I'm just going to call items. And I'm going to type it as an array of strings. So I don't actually have to type it as an array of strings if I don't want to, but this just helps me define it in case I need to use it later as what the type is. This is pretty normal of what you might want to do. And so we now have an array of strings that we could bind to it. And what doesn't it like? Oh, it's not that. It's getting my C# and my JavaScript and my TypeScript confused again. So we now have an array of strings. And if we go back to our template, you can see how collection binding works as well. So I'll create an unordered list. I'll create a list item. And here I'm going to use the *ng4 to indicate that I want to create a collection. And this ng4 here is going to repeat this li in every case. And there's some options for having, putting this on for only replicating what's inside. But for us, this is going to be fine. The star is actually, I don't remember what the star is for. I'm sure that someone will correct me later, but there is a special syntax for what the star actually means here. But effectively, we want to say something like a for each loop, right? We want to say item of items. Now, this is the bug I run into every time, is I want to go in because I'm a C# guy, right? Or even in JavaScript it's in. But I'm going to use of here. And there's a couple of things that are happening here. First, this is saying I want to create a local variable, and this pound inside the name is creating that local variable. That pound is indicating that this is going to be the name of an item, and then this is the property on our component. I should just be able to go item, and let's do the other one, which is value equals item, right? We're going to add the same to both cases. The value, oh, actually this isn't a select, but you can see where that would have gone. So we should now in our page be able to see that it's just creating the 3 elements there, right? Pretty simple. How are we doing on time? We're getting to it, but it's a lot more to cover. We'll see how far we can get, but most of the ASP.NET stuff has been done. What if we don't want an array of items? What if we really want is an array of objects? So let's create a title, new blog. Let's say body. This is a blog. And let's say published as new date, right? So we're creating a structure here that is not just an array of strings. And of course, it's going to complain because we told it was an array of string, not an array of these objects. Let me just create something so they're different. And so we could certainly just say that this is an array and it would be fine with that. Eventually, right? Untyped. And in fact, we could just get rid of that to make it untyped. More interestingly is what if we want to define the shape, but not really a whole class structure for this? We can create an interface in TypeScript, and I'll call this my iBlog entry interface, for lack of a better name. I'll say title string, body string and published date, right? Then I can tell it that I want an array of I blog entry, and it will check that the things being assigned here conform to that interface. So this is really, creating the contract of what we expect the blog entry to be and doing that type checking for us. Now that we're doing that, we could change this from item to item.title. Item.published. And I know title shouldn't be Pascal cased. Been doing a lot of C# lately, as you can tell. We now have the new blog entries, and we get this really user-friendly version of time, right? This is, as friendly as it gets for describing the time zone and times and all that. But that's not really what we want. And this is where the idea of pipes come in. What we think of as, converters and other things and other libraries. So we can add a pipe at the end, which is why they like to call them pipes, and describe how we want this to be formatted. And so there's a few different versions of this. And we can say, I'm using my cheat sheet because I always forget this, short date. And you can write these formatters as well, but this is saying in the template we're going to describe how to format the data. We don't want to necessarily do that in the TypeScript or the JavaScript code. We want to have the binding itself do this formatting. By going to short date, we can now get a short date. And there's a number of these, and you can even use, masks and things to do this formatting. But knowing that there are pipes for formatting is an interesting part of this. So what we've done so far isn't rocket science or that interesting. Let's talk about actually implementing our contact form. And we're going to go way over, but I'm going to go ahead and run it. And I appreciate everyone who has been able to come out, even though we haven't had really a lot of time to go through the meat of this. But I'm going to continue recording. If you have to drop off, remember, you'll be able to watch this later. And if you want to know more about ASP.NET Core, my Pluralsight course on ASP.NET 5, which will be renamed soon to ASP.NET Core, is out there, and feel free to watch it. But let's go ahead and implement this contact page. Remember that I commented out the actual view of the contact page down here. I'm just going to move all this to the template. This will become part of our template, right? Let's move this stuff to there. I'm going to leave all that code in there, even though it's a little ugly. Though I am going to get rid of the item stuff because our screen is only so big. So do the HTML comment out of that, but let's make sure it's still valid. Yeah, so now we have that contact page being emitted, but we're not really doing any of the interesting things here to implement the page, right? Most of that's going to happen over here in our component. Let's do this down here. I'm going to start with sort of the very Angular1 sort of way of doing this. So I'm going to create a property called form data, and I'm just going to give it some default properties so that we're not having, not going to have to watch me type this every time. Email, password, and they confirm password. Oops, that's not right at all. Subject, proposal, let's say, and a message. Hey there, love the course, right? So this is just some data we want to bind to our form. Just a property. It's in an object with some properties that really conform to that. And so let's come over here and see what that looks like. This form is just a bootstrap for form. Shouldn't be any different than you've probably seen. We can use attributes here to really change them to do it. So what we want to do is use ng model, which is a property there to say form data dot name. Let's propagate this out to the other controls. Email. Select has a subject. And the text area has the message, right? So ng model is in the very sort of Angular 1 way of doing it is just going to take properties and bind them there. But what we see here is kind of odd. It says form, it just has the properties. And the reason for that is we're not actually doing the binding. If you remember a minute ago, I said that in order to do one-way binding, we would include brackets, right? I'll actually just use some search and replace here. Replace them all. Using the brackets, we now have the properties actually being set. Ooh, we have binding. That's awesome. Let's come up to the form and let's do a event for submit. Now, submit is not actually is the Angular name of the form being submitted, and we'll do on submit as the method that we want to implement. I'll just use some cheeky JavaScript and just say alert this.formData.name, right? Just want to go ahead and show the name in the alert. We have our data there. If I print send message to send the form, it didn't work. Let's figure out why. Whoops. It actually sent the form for some reason. Oh, because whole camel casing thing. Let's go ahead and send message, and it should show me Sean. Awesome, right? It's pulling the data, but what if I change this? Still showing Sean. The reason for that is, as I sort of hinted at a minute ago, this ng model is only one-way binding. It's only pushing it into the control. It's not pushing it out. So how do we change this to do both? Well, the event syntax here is sort of a hint, because event is sort of the opposite of one-way binding. It's reacting to change, whereas the one-way binding is pushing data into the control. So that's the reason why these end up looking like that, right? It has both to say go in both directions. And I'm going to use search and replace here to replace them. And once we do that, if I change this, then the two-way binding is actually working. Awesome, right? We now have two-way binding in a sort of simple way. There are different opinions about the best way to do sort of form management in Angular 2. A lot of people, especially people who have done Angular 1, this is pretty comfortable. They know what to do here. They can handle it in exactly the way they want to. And there's certainly attributes here for, putting required to make the field required and all that sort of thing, where you're binding the validation directly as attributes onto the inputs. And that does work. I kind of prefer being able to test the form itself for its own validation. And so in this case, I'm going to use something called controls and form builder. This is where you're going to define what the form looks like and then bind to it in that way. And here we need another import. And this time I'm going to bring in 3 things. Now, the reason for this curly syntax and import, if you haven't looked at this before, is this allows us to import several objects from a single file. You can export more than one thing from each file, so you don't have to have the granularity. In this case, Angular2 actually exposes a number of things from Angular2 common until I can grab all 3 at once, and I have to have individual controls. And this also allows us to start thinking a little bit about how dependency injection works, right? I've imported the type here of form builder, the type of control, the type of control group. And so I can actually create a constructor on our class. That's going to be called when this object is created, and it's created by Angular2. But I'm going to bring in an object called FB and indicate that it is a form builder object. I'm going to use this to build my form, unsurprisingly. And this is the basis of the injection, the dependency injection inside of Angular2, and that is using these types to inject requirements into these classes. And so now when we construct one of these classes through Angular2, it's going to supply this for us and anything else that it requires. And you can certainly be building your own modules in that same way. The way we're going to create the form is we're going to create a local variable that's going to replace our form data here. So let's actually get rid of the form data guy, and we're going to create one, and I'll call it the form, and I'm going to type it as a control group. This is going to be a group of controls that we're going to use, and I'm going to assign it here. And I'm going to assign it by calling formBuilder.group. FormBuilder.group allows me to just pass in an array. Whoops, let me bring this back. An array of, I would say array, that's wrong. An object that creates each of the controls. So I'm going to name it. I'm going to name an object and then send in some attributes about it. So the name control is going to be called name, and then I'm going to give it a default property value. And let me repeat that for the other 4 controls we need. We need email, subject, and message. Same ones we were using before. Probably shouldn't be leaking my email address like this, but if you haven't figured it out by now, it's about time you did. And this is from NG2, right? So just a simple piece. And the form, we can actually get at the value by saying the form.name.value. Now, in this case, it's going to complain because this is a dynamic object that's being created. But we're going to ignore this error because it's still going to compile it and it's going to work correctly for us. Sort of prove that, we haven't bound this up to the page yet. Whoops, I didn't mean to run it. Let's look in here. And the binding's failing because we no longer have that form data object, but when we do send message, it's going to fail. What did I do wrong? I still have the on submit. Okay. Stop on other pages. Let me get rid of that. I think this is because we're getting binding failures, it's not going to show it to us. If we look at the console, yeah, it's showing that it's missing all this form data stuff that we put in. So let's fix that first, and then I'll show you what I'm talking about. In this case, instead of using ng model, I'm going to use a different directive called ng control. And notice that in this case, we're not binding to an individual property. The ng control doesn't need the binding syntaxes around it. It doesn't need the bracket or the parenthesis. And so here we can just say name, email, because these are the names of the controls, not of the properties that contain the data, but the actual controls. Let's see if that gets better. Supposed to be better. Think I did something wrong. Give me just a second. Yeah, I did something wrong, but let's figure out why, because it should at least be complaining if it doesn't have the values. These do need the bracket syntax, but I didn't think so. Oh. I know what it is. We need to also not just the name, but the form.name, because we're specifying the actual control we're using. Luckily, this is going to be saved for a long time. And I lied. What did I forget? This is awfully embarrassing. Is it the, if these need to be bound that way? Let's find out. Nope. It's right the first time. I think it's ng form control. I always get, there's 3 different ways to do it, and I always do the wrong one. Let's see if that's right. Nope. I think we need this to be added, which I never got into my template, but I think we need the ng form model. If I got this right. The form. This is where you're specifying what is the property for this form. Otherwise, I'm going to go pull the other project and then I'll show you. Yeah, that's what I was afraid of. Okay. I'm going to pull the after so you don't have to just watch me thrash. And I'll walk through what's happening because evidently somebody got his control wrong. There it is, ng form model. Back just for a second. I should have just kept that open. This is essentially what's happening. We have the form as a property that contains the group, and we're going to bind ng form model with the syntax to this entire form, and then we can just use the name of each control to specify what we want here. And that's going to fail because it's not running now, because that's annoying. Should be controls. I still don't think it's going to allow me to run it without. Yeah, it's getting a failure. Okay. Let's do it this way. This will make will make TypeScript happy because we're now handling all the typeness. But the other format should also work. But for now, let's just make TypeScript happy. Because I'm certainly, staying on the edge of all this. And now we have it working. If we change this and show the message, we'll now see we're getting the full round trip binding the way we want it to be. And one of the questions you might have is, how do we actually debug this? Do we have to debug the JavaScript, which you can see the structure of what we're doing here in the generated JavaScript. So it's not undebuggable, but it's not as clear as it could be. Well, Firefox, as far as I know, doesn't have a good way to do TypeScript, but Chrome does. So let's change this just for a moment over to Chrome. Sometimes Chrome extensions cause me problems in development, so I don't want to just use Chrome all the time. But here in my contact page, let me open up the developer tools. And under sources app, we'll actually see the TypeScript as well as the JavaScript. And in order for this debugging to work, you need to have both of them out publicly available. But it's going to use the map files to figure out what's actually being executed. So here's I shouldn't have made that bigger. Here's our TypeScript file. And let's go and put a breakpoint in the TypeScript file, right? And let's do send message. Guess what? We're debugging based on the TypeScript file itself directly in Chrome. So using TypeScript doesn't really get us out of the problem of being able to do this sort of debugging. We can still do the debugging. It's using the map files that are being created by TypeScript as well as the TypeScript files to be able to give the illusion of actually being able to debug this stuff directly in the browser. So that's very exciting, that we have a solution for debugging this stuff directly in the browser. And I'm going to switch back over to Firefox because it's just cleaner. When I'm doing a lot of debugging, using Chrome, that makes a lot of sense. But for what we're doing, this is all good enough. So we've done this structure of creating the form builder and such, but we haven't really, we've done this extra ceremony. Why would we bother with this? And the reason is that we can pass in as another parameter to each of these controls the validation that it needs. So let's bring in the validators. Another property from common. Now we can say validators dot required. Right? So this is going to add the validation directly to the control so that the markup doesn't necessarily need to know what the validation is, but we can get closer to where the data is actually, knowing what the data is. So over on our template, we can actually check for these. So let's make a span that has a nice star in it, and we'll use ngIf, which is another directive that says show this if certain things occur. So here we're going to say the form controls name that has error required. We can also do is valid as well, but because we might have more than one kind of validation, I like to use the as error as a better solution to that. I'll do that for this, and I'll do it for this as well. Let's change this to message and this to email. So none of these are showing up now because they're all valid. But if we go back and do an empty one, it's going to show us that required error for us. Same for this one, and same for this one, right? So we're getting that real-time validation we want and being able to show what we want in the UI based on whether that error exists. What if we also want min length? Well, there's a special validator. I kind of wish they would change this to just be an endless collection of validation, but they haven't, called compose. And compose allows you to then send in an array of validations. A little more ceremony, but let's go ahead and add min length here. So you now have unrequired, we have validation that says min length, and then we can, of course, show this as well. There, min length. And we'll just say too short, right? Really simple validation. And I did something wrong. Oh, I did it on the wrong one. Sorry about that. Did I do it on the wrong one here too? Did it on name, validate is required. Oh, I said 5. I meant to say 10. What did I do wrong? Required in min length. Oh, I have to spell min length correctly. It's too short by default, but it will show the required first, and I'll say Sean Wildermuth, and then it goes away, right? As soon as we cross the 10, it goes away. We could color it and change all sorts of things if we want. But this is giving us that validation. And in that same way, we can come down here to the submit button and say disabled. And again, what we're doing here is we're setting the disabled flag based on some expression. And that expression will be the form is valid, disabled if it's not valid. And I think that's the right spelling of is valid. We have the too short, and so this is disabled. But as soon as we fix this, it should go back to is valid. Oh, this, yeah, it's probably not the right one. Let's try that. Yeah, it's called valid. Too short and it's disabled. And as soon as we add enough properties, it's enabled. Woohoo! So this is showing you the different pieces, and we could certainly get down into the nitty-gritty of sending HTTP and all those other things, but we don't really have time for that. We're already an hour and 20 minutes into it, but it should give you a taste of sort of where this is all starting, how to integrate with the ASP.NET Core projects, as well as sort of the beginning taste of how you would actually build these individual pieces, what the development experience is and such. So I'm going to go over and see if there's any questions, but I'm guessing I lost some of my viewers by now. I have, and I'm going to end it there. Let me drop my last slide just so you can see. Angular2 is at angular.io. You can get ASP.NET is where you can get ASP.NET Core, still called ASP.NET 5 there, but that will be changing in the next release. My course on Angular Core, on ASP.NET Core does not include Angular 2 coverage, but does include Angular 1 coverage. Is at seanw.me/ASP.NET Core. my blog where you can find more information about a lot of this. And this is the project on GitHub, includes the sample code, the Angular2, the other pieces I'm working on. It is a work in progress. I'm not guaranteeing the build will work every time you look at it, but it'll be a way you can get at the code. And I appreciate everyone coming to watch the webcast, and have a great day.